thanks to Graham and Rachel in the Middle East Policy Forum at George Washington University for having us here, and thanks to Laryssa and Tarek for being here with me. So as we all know, on July 25th, which is Tunisia's Republic Day, and if anyone's interested in that significance, maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A session. On July 25th, President Kais Saied applied Article 80 of the Constitution. This article stipulates a legal state of exception. Under this provision, he froze parliamentary activities, removed the immunity of parliamentary deputies, and dissolved the government that was headed by former Prime Minister Hisham Meshishi. Article 80 was only supposed to function or been in effect for 30 days. It was prolonged, and then 2 months later, he issued Presidential Decree 117, which outlined expanded presidential powers. These powers allowed him to rule by decree and clearly run counter to the separation of powers outlined in Tunisia's 2014 constitution. A week later, Saied again made headlines naming Najla Bouden as Tunisia's and the Arab world's first female prime minister. Internationally, and among some of Tunisia's political elites, the country has been celebrated as the Arab world's sole democracy following the 2011 revolution. In this context, Saied's actions were quickly categorized as a coup against democracy, a constitutional coup, an autogolpe or self-coup, or even a military-backed coup d'etat. At this moment, and for the first time since Tunisia's democratic transition began in 2011, a striking tension became clear. Minutes after Saied's announcement of Article 80, Tunisians took to the streets in mass public celebration, which included fireworks that lasted throughout the night, despite a countrywide 8 p.m. curfew during the midst of the nation's worst coronavirus infection to date. While international observers, political parties, and increasingly civil society and media voiced their concern, Saied has surprisingly maintained his popularity since July 25th. In a public opinion survey released after the 25th, the 3 days after the 25th, 87% of Tunisians reported being favorable or partially favorable to his decisions. And in a poll conducted just days after Presidential Decree 117, close to 80% claimed to be satisfied with his actions. But the country's political class is largely divided. And of course, public opinion is playing a major role in shaping how political parties are responding. But at the same time, pre-existing internal divisions within political parties are exposing themselves more profoundly than ever before. And while a number of anti-coup protests have been organized by the opposition, which is itself deeply divided, to date, turnout has been significantly less than the rival pro-Saied rallies. This may change, and in fact, it seems to be changing every day. The symbolics of Saied's invocation of Article 80 on Republic Day can be read in many ways, but perhaps the most widely held interpretation is that it broke an unpopular political status quo. Coming out of a pandemic or during a pandemic and living through one of the worst economic situations since the early 1980s, many Tunisians seem to be willing to abandon the 2014 constitution and its political system in the hopes for a better system that reflects their needs and interests. And while this is shocking, if not frightening, it does not mean that they necessarily support a return to an authoritarian system. Rather, many Tunisians believe that the 2014 political system simply perpetuated the socioeconomic despotism of the former regime within a new constitutional framework dominated by political parties. And I want to stress that Tunisians are disaffected by a whole range of negative perceptions about the political system. And here we could talk about increasing political infighting, more than 200 political parties, which at a point in time, it doesn't make sense. What do these parties represent? And really the confusion of where political power lies in the executive. I would also suggest that this is not atypical in a nascent democracy emerging from decades of single party rule. And just to finish, support for Saied, I think, can be understood as a widespread popular demand that the 2011 revolution be implemented in a democratic framework where the definition of democratic goes a little bit further than just electoral processes and addresses Tunisia's deep-seated socioeconomic grievances. And this is really nothing new. The Arab Barometer has consistently reported on where Tunisians stand vis-a-vis representative democracy, which is corroborated by close to the 20,000 sit-ins, demonstrations, and wildcat protests identified by the Tunisian Forum for Social and Economic Rights between October 2019, which was when Saied was elected, and his July 25th announcement. So people want immediate solutions to a decade of demands. But the question is how long this goodwill, meaning support of Kais Saied's problematic actions, will last.
Great, thank you so much. Tarek, your thoughts about the conditions under which these these moments became possible?
I'm gonna start with the general context, then I'm gonna move to how Kais Saied actually himself framed and justified the activation of Article 80 of the Tunisian Constitution, which, for those who are interested in constitutional history, it's very much close to the Article 16 of the French Constitution, according to which Charles de Gaulle actually used. Actually, he used in the 1960s at some point. Let's start with the general context. I'm going to start with just a simple anecdote with a taxi that I just, you know, a lot of the news in Tunisia can be actually provided from taxi drivers. And the taxi guy who just actually took me from one point to the other point was talking about how Tunisia now is more open. We have Libyans coming in, Algerians who might be allowed to come in Tunisia in the coming days, and things are better. And the main thing he said is that people are vaccinated. And of course, as any taxi driver, he has his own conspiracy theory about vaccines. But the conspiracy theory here goes with the idea that the former government of Mashishi, supported by the parliamentarian bloc led by Nahda, was actually trying to postpone vaccination and was not serious about bringing in vaccination so that they can actually sell us Tunisians vaccines afterwards. This picture, this perception, even though it's by a taxi driver, I mean, and I won't go into that, it's part of a general feeling that the main really cause that allowed Kais Saied to activate, to be able to activate Article 80. I know for a fact he was thinking about that since November 2020. He was able to do that because of the general context, and the many deaths of Tunisians because of the pandemic. In the months that preceded July 25, May, June, July, the number of deaths were unprecedented and were clearly shocking for so many Tunisians. The very fact that Tunisians can just die just like that in hundreds because of some kind of a flu variation was perceived by Tunisians as a red line. That was really the red line that Kais Saied built on to be able to activate Article 80. In addition to that, you have the political crisis. You have someone who's voted into the presidential office with about 3 million, where 2,700,000 in October 2019, and he's seen as totally marginalized by a political elite that was in power for so many years now, and we're going to talk about the 2019 elections afterwards. And he seems to be voted out of his office by a political elite that is very much hated, and more importantly, by a parliament that is very much hated. The most hated institution in Tunisia is certainly the parliament. It's even more hated than the political parties, which just gives you the idea of how much the parliament is really being hated. So that political crisis, even though people, they would think rationally, they would see that the different actors of the political elite are responsible, including Kais Saied, but because he was seen as the outsider, as someone who's voted out of his office by a political elite that is very much hated, by the parliament that is very much hated, it's because of that. That actually helped him build on the momentum of July 25. And really the other last minute reason was when a leader of Nahda, that's very important. It's an anecdote, but it was somehow exaggerated, but it helped a lot, the July 25 moment. It's when a major leader of Al-Nahda, Abdelkarim Al-Harouni, the president of the Shura Council, went for a sit-in just in front of the government's office, asking for the government to issue a decree that would facilitate the state or the reconciliation reparations, material reparations for Al-Nahda's, mainly Al-Nahda's base. That actually built on the momentum, and it showed again that the political elite, specifically Al-Nahda, was more interested during the time of the COVID-19 basically pandemic, so many deaths, was more interested in having reparations for its own soldiers rather than the public interest. These are really the direct, immediate reasons, and that's the context upon which Kais Saied was able to basically declare the night of July 25 the activation of Article 80. During that day, manifestations that were around the country, and more importantly, they targeted the headquarters of Al-Nahda party in so many little towns, and it showed really the level of hate towards the main leading party throughout the last decade in Tunisia. So I'm gonna stop here. That's the immediate context. We're gonna try to get more in depth with Laryssa's questions afterwards.
Great. Thank you, Tarek and Bobby, for kind of bringing all these different factors together that created that immediate condition. But one of the questions I want to ask both of you is something that many observers here I mean in Tunisia, have been paying attention to, which is starting with his election to power in 2019. And there was a bit of a response by observers to the crisis of democracy narrative that quickly took over after July 25th, which was, we understand people were not following what had happened in 2019 and thereafter. So I want to ask you about that specific moment and that time frame. So when he was elected, when Kais Saied was elected in 2019, with a landslide victory well over 70%, the debate in Tunisia and globally among the community that has been paying very close attention to Tunisia's transition since 2011 was rife with worries about populism. So that was both his electoral campaign and slogans, the composition of his support base, his speeches, as well as promises to fix Tunisia and to meet the objectives of the 2011 revolution. And all those were kind of based on a notion of popular will. So how do you think that these debates figure today? And what can we learn from them to grasp what is going on in the political present? I'm going to turn to Bobby first and then to Tarek.
Great, thanks. Shab Yurid, or the people want, is both the nationwide revolutionary call in Tunisia, but also Kais Saied's 2019 electoral slogan. This slogan can be either democratic or populist, and it's as vague as it is densely packed. In 2011, January 2011, citizens cried for the fall of the Ben Ali regime and its replacement with the democratic system. But what that democracy would be, and more importantly, what it would do and for whom, was never really clearly defined. Many vocal outside observers, including academics, pundits, policymakers, and the development community, understood this to be some sort of multi-party liberal democracy. And this definition went hand in hand with what is known in political science as a minimalist or proceduralist approach to democracy, which is measured by elections. This kind of reductionism, if you will, has really reduced politics down to voting behavior and patterns, including a disproportionate focus on cross-ideological coalitions among parties, or what is also known as consensual power agreements that consolidate democracy. Less attention in this dominant approach, even though registered by international and Tunisian public opinion surveys, has really been paid to the heart of Tunisia's historical political struggle and struggles. And these really include wealth distribution, transitional justice, social justice, and largely within a meaningful framework to combat corruption. And even worse, by ignoring the breadth of aspirations made possible by the revolution, such minimalist approaches also reduced the revolution to one kind of democracy, ascribing democracy to a set of institutions and episodic events, mainly elections. And I think here's the crux of the problem. For many Tunisians, this minimalist democracy didn't capture the aims of the 2011 revolution. According to the 2011 Air Barometer survey, the first and second most important reasons for anti-Ben Ali protests were for improving the economic situation, followed by combating corruption, and this presumably within a democratic framework. As anywhere else, how people define democracy diverges. And according to the same survey, at the same time, when asked to identify the most important characteristic of democracy, Tunisians were split between political liberties and economic rights. While close to 30% of respondents indicated that democracy is the opportunity to change the government through elections, 22% defined it as providing basic items such as food, housing, and clothing to every citizen. And 21% claimed that democracy should really be focused on narrowing the gap between the rich and poor. So in other words, democratic elections were a means or a strategy of implementing the revolution, which is supposed to create the conditions of a dignified life that Tunisians have been asking for.
Great. Tarek, your thoughts about the moment in 2019 and when Kais Saied was elected to power?
Well, the 2019 elections is really the first warning that there is something really deep that is not working with the Tunisian democratic experiment. And that liberal democracy, as it's theorized, is being really, it had an accident, a major accident in 2019. The 2019 elections, when we count the votes, it's mainly, we can see that the majority of the votes are taken by different populist variations. And by populism here, I'm embracing Kasmadi's definition, which basically defines populism as this thin ideology of the claim of representing the people. The claim of representing the people against it was a common currency in elections. And the two major
we're just Hey Tarek?
Defines populist. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, you might turn off your video just for a moment to see if that helps with the connection. It just is breaking up a bit. Apologies. Go for it.
Can you hear me now?
That's actually seems better.
Okay, sorry about that.
No.
Yeah, so the two candidates, main candidates in the presidential elections, Kais Saied and Nabil Karoui, can be defined as populist. In addition to that, we have so many other party coalitions, either with supporting the old regime or basically building their ideology on anti-French sentiments. The majority of the votes went to these different candidates. And it was the first clear warning that no matter what the vote was in 2019 elections, it's clear that the vote was against by the end of the day. It was against the old political elite by now that ruled the country from 2011 to 2019. And Nokhba, the elite, became the target of these new, basically politicians and traditional politicians. And the main guy was Kais Saied. And I think many people missed Kais Saied at that time. I remember a parliamentarian from a major Western country asking me after the 2019 elections, so what's wrong with Tunisia? I said, well, what's wrong? And he said, well, you have a president who is not very happy with the LGBTQ community. And they said, yes, yeah, that it seems that's the case, but that's really not the problem, the main problem in Tunisia now. It's more complicated than that. And clearly there was like a sense of rejecting the possibility of there is something new and unusual in the Tunisian experiment. Because, you know, for so many years, Tunisia has been handled as the success story, and things are going fine. Well, there are a few accidents, but by the end, it's succeeding. But that narrative, that wish by the end of seeing the Tunisian model succeeding, blinded so many people from seeing the warning of the 2019 elections and prevented them basically from seeing what's going to happen in the next month. So I'm gonna stop there, and I'm gonna try to develop some other ideas on the basis of the 2019 elections afterwards. Sorry about the interruption.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm going to shift. I also received a question that I think a question from an attendee, and I think that perhaps our next discussion point is going to answer some of this. So I'm going to kind of scoop into a bit of a nitty-gritty debate that's been happening in Tunisia, but that has also been picked up by the international community, especially the international community that has been invested in democracy building in Tunisia. So one of the important clues that might have been glanced over since 2019, since that moment when Kais was elected, is a sovereigntist discourse that has started worrying the international community for that moment, and has also raised critical questions about what kind of intervention, democracy aid, economic aid, and so on, corresponds with the expectations of voting citizens. So not just 2019, but previous electoral cycles as well. Can you comment a little bit on this tension, and perhaps also on the tension between legitimacy and legality that is so central to politics right now? And I'm going to turn to Tarek first, and then Bobby, because Tarek has been commenting quite a lot on the sovereigntist question.
Okay, thank you, Laryssa. So I'm gonna just finish off really with a point that I was trying to say in the 2019 elections. The reason for a vote against the elite, the dominant political elite in the 2019 elections, because basically they failed to deliver on the social economic level. But not only that, it's about the sense of reducing politics into this very closed room of basically few politicians decided who's going to get what. And by the end, nothing is done about economic reforms and economic and social reforms. So that's the main reason, really, of what has been happening since 2019 elections. And the whole consensus issue, the has been used as an excuse to say, well, things are going well since we have Islamists and secularists agreeing about these identity politics issue. But by the end, people were not really interested in identity politics. People were more interested in economic and social issue, and even corruption is part of the interest in the economic and social issues. Now, the international support to Tunisia is like this kind of curriculum that has been reproduced over and over. And I think the best form of to understand this is how the IMF has been working since the agreement of 2013 between the Troika government and the IMF in the summer of 2013. The idea is, well, we have a model and we're going to just have to go for it. And nothing has been discussed on the Tunisian side. It is, well, since the West is happy with this, we're going to go for it. The main thing that we're going to have to resolve our own problems by consensus, meaning the identity politics. By the end, there was no debate about economic and social issues. You're going to have elections over elections. And the division is not about how we're going to handle the economy. The IMF is proposing certain reforms. Different governments are not resisting the reforms. They're afraid of the reforms because of the coming elections. and nothing has been debated about these issues until this moment. So this is really and on the other side, the international community is dealing with the issue. Well, they're going to have to absorb these elections. They're going to have to go for them by the end. And maybe they're thinking that Kais Saied is the nice moment, since we have a clear vis-a-vis and he's strong in terms of popularity. And by the end, he has no economic and social program. And they're going to be wrong again, because this is a guy who's clearly, I would borrow a term that I have heard in the Congress debate, a socialist or socialist or whatever that means. Well, this is a guy who's gonna go again for narratives that are very important in Tunisia, in the building up of the Tunisian national state. And it goes with the idea of sovereignty, that any political act has to serve a certain social goal or a certain social narrative. And since the 1960s, the building of the Tunisian state has been about that, about basically serving, especially the middle class and the lower classes. And that's why the unions are still strong, and so on and so forth. So I'm saying this because reading this point, the issue of sovereignty, should be in order to understand what's going to happen in the future, especially about the intentions of Kais Saied. This is not a guy who's just throwing away words about sovereignty to counter pressure about democracy in Tunisia. That's part of the game, but that's not the main game here. The main game is we're going to have most probably a clash between the international community and this guy, Kais Saied, about what's the meaning of a national state? What's the meaning of politics by the end, if not social, responding to social needs? And sorry for taking too long.
No, not at all. Bobby, can you comment a little bit on the tension between legality and legitimacy, which is something that Kais Saied has been playing on quite a lot, obviously since he was elected, but more specifically in the last couple of months?
Yeah, great. And I think this links to the issue of sovereignty. And I think Saied links the issue of sovereignty to this longstanding tension between what's legitimate and what's legal, that is legitimacy and legality. And we oftentimes take this tension to be for granted, and we often assume that the two notions overlap, but there are many historical cases of illegitimate law or cases where morally legitimate actions are in fact against the law. So Saied based his decision to invoke Article 80 and his presidential decree 117 on this disjuncture. The legitimacy of his acts, he claimed, are based on the 2014 Constitution's preamble in Article 3, which claimed that the people are the custodians of sovereignty. This position, his position then, he makes an acrobatic leap and says, because the way the Constitution itself was written, Tunisian citizens were not able to fully enjoy their post-revolution sovereignty. And so this notion of legitimate sovereignty trumps legality of the Constitution, which is a bit shocking, right? For the reasons we've already mentioned, namely the failure of the wave of governments to address the aspirations of the revolution in tackling economic inequality, corruption, and transitional justice, many Tunisians support Said's current position. Now, in 2019, Saied did win more votes than any other Tunisian politician or party to date. And public opinion surveys do show that he and his actions remain popular. But I think what scares many people, and especially the political elite, but also foreign policymakers, is that Saied is claiming exclusive rights to determine who the people are, what they want, and how to define sovereignty. Whereas in democracies, these issues are debated and fought out in elections. And I think this is a classic debate between the status quo and hoping things get better, versus starting from scratch and trying something new, if not recklessly new. And I think the problem is that the president's positions aren't fully hashed out. For example, how will his project, which Tarek will talk about in a bit, address the three key demands of the revolution? Right? Maybe a bottom-up, top-down system will allow Tunisians a greater say in developmental choices, but it could also just be reinventing the wheel. Right? Tunisia has already got a local level developmental deliberation process, even though it's stalled. You know, how will he finance anything? How is he going to deal with the looming fiscal crisis? And how will this government actually pay state wages this November, right? Sort of there could be a major wage crunch in just a month's time. Will he engage the IMF, however unpopular? And here we can think of Greece and Syriza taking power and then sort of crumbling to the European Union. Or will he attempt to borrow money from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, or Algeria? And how would he square either choice with his notions of sovereignty, right? What are Said's plans for transitional justice? And does he have a real plan for combating corruption? As his critics fear, is he just going to use this theme to attack his opponents, reminiscent of previous post-revolutionary governments? And at this point, we just don't know.
Great. So in the interest of time, because we only have 21 minutes left, I'm going to combine a little bit the last two questions I had, which are about democracy, and focus really on the political present right now. One of the things I wanted to tease out are, but perhaps we can do this in the Q&A, are these different notions of democracy and what Tunisians are understanding democracy to be, which is something that has been registered in surveys in the Arab Barometer, but also in Tunisian surveys. So for instance, one very interesting finding has been over the years that Tunisians support democracy over other systems, but a big percentage of respondents do not believe that they currently live in a democracy. So the support is there, but there's a critique of the system that has been in place. So I want to specifically talk about that before we turn to the Q&A. And I will ask Tarek to go first and then have Bobby respond. Do you see a potentiality for a new kind of representative democratic model or for rebuilding popular trust in parliament? As Tarek, you have mentioned, a lot of hatred is directed towards parliament, and a lot of the dissatisfaction that Bobby has mentioned in the surveys is about that kind of representative democratic system. What kind of political system do you think Kais Saied wants to establish? And do you think that his intellectual ideas around bottom-up democracy, direct democracy, map onto the real and profound structural issues, debt, currency devaluations, unemployment, and so forth, that Tunisia is facing and has been facing? So Tarek, if you can go first for about 3 minutes, and then Bobby for 2 minutes, and then we'll turn it to the audience.
Wow, I'm gonna have really quick for this one. It's well, first of all, our parliamentarian democracy it was handicapped since the beginning by an electoral law that does not allow for a clear majority. Let's put that as clear as possible. That's a clear handicap. Added to that is the tendency for the dominant political elite, for not focusing on reforms but focusing on how they can distribute power within the elite. And that made the parliament, by the end, the focus of hatred, because it's a lot of basically debates, a lot of shouting, a lot of fighting, but with no venues and with no resolutions. And yet at the same time, the MPs are having all of these basically privileges, especially the privilege of immunity that was seen as highly problematic by the Tunisian public, especially when you have MPs that are known to be like corrupt businessmen, or that's at least the perception, and they use immunity to protect themselves. So that put liberal democracy in the form of parliamentarian democracy, the Tunisian experiment, at the heart of a lot of criticism and even hatred. Secondly, now, what's Kais Saied's solution? And clearly he's been talking about this since 2011. I'm not going to summarize his solution in 1 minute. That's going to be basically an insult to his whole, to something he's trying to do now for at least 10 years. Basically, the idea is, well, the parliament is not going to be elected directly by the people. We're going to have to focus on local councils. It's local councils that are going to ascend the MPs via regional councils. And executive power is going to be a presidential, within the hands of the president. It's a complicated system, never tried before. Even his supporters, a very close group of his supporters, are having really some difficulties explaining the system. the main issue that we're going to face, and we're going to talk about current events later, is if Kais Saied is going to push people into a referendum that's going to vote on the amendment of the constitution, making the choice between black and white, between parliamentarian democracy that they tried, they hate, and the new system he wants to have that is highly complicated, never tried before, and might be even more problematic than parliamentarian democracy. That's the main issue that we're going to deal with the next months, and that's why he doesn't want to have a timeline now. He wants to have some time to end the exceptional state. So that's something that we're going to talk about later.
And Bobby, can you comment on what kind of political system, or maybe perhaps revisit some of the opinion survey figures that can help us frame what we are to expect from his new proposal that Tarek so eloquently summarized in 1 minute?
So yeah, I think one of the most important figures that's come out in the surveys is sort of that prior to July 25th, there's something like 15% confidence in Parliament. And you take that figure with the 20,000 protests that there were over the last year and a half, then it's really hard to envision how Tunisians could have possibly supported any kind of democracy that has been in place for the last 10 years. And in fact, if you look at the public opinion surveys done by the Arab Barometer, and we're going to have the latest session of the Arab Barometer coming out shortly. In 2018, when asked whether they lived in a democracy, 40% of Tunisians responded more negatively that they actually did not live in a democracy. About 20% were sort of, we don't know, and only 25% believed that they lived in a democracy. But I want to highlight again my previous point that having said that, 80% of Tunisians believe that democracy is the best system. So they want some sort of democratic system. But perhaps maybe we just need to take it seriously into consideration that the grievances and demands are real, especially these socioeconomic grievances. And they have to be part of the conversation that outside analysts, academics, and the development world is having. And it's what I think the president needs to take those seriously into consideration too. It's great to propose a new model where there's more deliberation, but if the system gets gummed up, then people will be just as angry. Sort of, they're tired of stasis. So at the end of the day, I think democracy can't just simply be seen as like a descriptive model. It's got to take into consideration issues that people who are actually living in that democracy take seriously. And if we don't do that, it's at our own risk. It's at our own peril. Thanks.
Okay, so before I turn it to Q&A, I just briefly would like for both of you to comment on perhaps the most current event, which is the appointment of a new government that was named just a week ago. What kind of composition do you think is in power right now? And what do you think the government's priority is? And to what extent will they be able to even begin implementing this extraordinarily expansive program that Tarek, you summarized, that Kais Saied is proposing? I'll go to Tarek and then to Bobby.
Well, in few words, Kais Saied, even though he doesn't like the elite, the political elite, party elites, he tried to work with them between 2019 until basically the beginning of the summer of 2021, when all political solutions basically evaporated. Now he's taking power totally, and by decree 117 declared in September 22nd, he has by de facto dictatorial prerogatives. So in terms of added to that, he has no timeline. He did not declare any timeline. He said clearly that he's going to have a referendum. Clearly, he's going to go for a referendum to amend the constitutions before the elections. He's not going to go for next elections before amending the constitution. And he's going to try to get in his agenda, that is his political system. Now, facing that is the issue of the financial deficit and the huge economic budget issues. He's going to try, at least he was given some promises by especially Gulf states, the UAE and the Saudi Arabia, to compensate for the budget deficit by the end of this year. these next months are going to be hugely crucial in terms of the balance of forces between Kais Saied, who still doesn't want to have a timeline. Maybe he wants even to go for 2024. He wants to have enough time to have a government achieving some kind of reforms. We're going to wait to see the agenda, the actual agenda of the government, and then to prepare the ground for a referendum that can allow his agenda, that is his own political system, to be voted in. This is his wishes. Doesn't mean that's possible. On the other side, we have the international community, especially the West, led by the US and the European Union, who are going to pressure as much as they can for two things. First of all, to have a timeline, and certainly a shorter timeline than Kais Saied wants. And secondly, that before the referendum, there is going to be a dialogue that would allow for some kind of a diverse proposal for the referendum, not a black and white referendum, but at least 3-4 answers. And because when you're going to ask 3-4 answers, especially if you're asked Tunisians if you want to have a presidential system or the parliamentarian democracy they had for the last 10 years, or the very complicated system Kais Saied wants to have, I can't say that many Tunisians are going to go for the presidential system. Because the whole idea is, again, for them, the state has to deliver. A democratic state or not, it has to deliver. It's not delivering, that's a problem. And delivering here means social economic issues. And they see that the presidential system, a clear vis-a-vis, someone clearly responsible for the government, should be able to deliver. Now, they're going to see a presidential system in action, because what we have since July 25, effectively, since September 22nd, from a legal point of view, after Decree 117, is a presidential system. So now it's up to Kais Saied to show what he can do. Can he deliver in the next month? That's going to be highly crucial for so many Tunisians to decide what kind of political system they want to have.
Great. So I have, Bobby, would you like to comment on the current events, or can I jump straight to questions, because there's a very interesting question that you might lend incredible insight to. So if you don't mind, I'm going to jump directly to a question first to Bobby, and then I'm going to go back to a question about foreign influence, which is obviously on the minds of many following the congressional hearing that occurred 6 days ago. So, to Bobby from WL, I think I know who this is. Can you say more about the Algerian position? There seems to be some daylight between Tebboun's support for Kais Saied and the wider regime elite's fears of instability and close historical relations with Ennahda. Also, do you really think Algeria will lend money given their own serious financial predicament?
I think the Algerian position has been pretty clear from the very beginning. Right in the first week, I think Tebboune had called, or the first 2 weeks, President Tebboune had called President Kais Saied twice or thrice, and Lamamra, Algeria's foreign minister, had visited Tunisia 3 times. So I think it was very clear from the beginning that Algeria was on board with what had happened. They'd seen sort of what was going on in Tunisia, and perhaps thought that was more risky than continuing the status quo was more risky than the Kais Saied gambit. And I think that there's a personal affinity between the two. There is also the long-standing historical foreign policy relationship between Algeria and Tunisia, though sometimes rocky. In more recent years, it's been very warm. So I think it is possible that Algeria would give a 0% interest loan to Tunisia. And I think that they could still do it despite the fact that Algeria has declining hydrocarbon revenues coming in right now. So I think that they could do that, and I think that they're probably likely to do that. And I guess I'll leave it at that.
Great. And so here's a question that, again, ties into the foreign influence that we can take in either direction. So to Tarek, how do the panelists well, I guess to both, to Tarek and to Bobby, how do the panelists evaluate the role of foreign political influence? Is any actor playing a constructive role, and what specifically about the United States?
Yes, that's a great question. So it's, well, I think they missed the process. Basically, the idea of having a model, consensual democracy, liberal democracy, something to export to the rest of the Arab world. That's our gift by the West to the Arab world. That's how democracy should be done. All of that is collapsing, and that's a huge issue. And I think it's not something that's gonna be okay. Let's close that chapter and start a new chapter. Something has to be done about basically assessing what went wrong in the decade, very important condensed decade of democratic experience in Tunisia. We need really deep discussions about that. And I salute actually the title of the Impasse of the Tunisian liberal democracy. It can be a title of a book, and it's making me think now about the possibility of doing something about that. It's well, it's clear that it was an abstract narrative, and we needed that model somehow. And here I'm talking about the international Western partners. The Western partners thought about, okay, let's push so much money for civil society, and let's have these young people basically having in civil society active, and they're gonna basically make something out of this. Let's have the old guys of the political elite do some consensus, and we're gonna have a nice success story. That's something that did not really succeed. It's 2019 elections showed very clearly the kind of hate towards the political elite, and civil society, its political influence is very limited. Now, I'm looking to the question of, so Kais Saied, is he the response? Especially, he embraces the revolution, he embraces December 17th, that is the radical narrative of the Tunisian revolution. Yet at the same time, he's looking at Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis to give him some money. Yes, it's a huge paradox. Here we have someone who's full of paradoxes, and he's evolving as a politician since 2019. He was not really a traditional politician before 2019, especially when I talk about forces. He was not into balance of forces before 2019. He was learning, and he is learning the balance of forces since 2019. And I think he's gonna be open to any advances to give him money, as long as he is gonna stay as the main decision maker, and he's gonna decide about the future. So his logic, I would say, would be like, okay, I'm gonna get money from counter-revolutionary regimes like Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis, but at the same time, I'm gonna decide what I'm gonna do with this money. They want the Brotherhood, Islamists out of power. I made them out of power. That's my dono deal with that. But in the future, I'm gonna be on the ground, the main decision maker. I need money to fill in the budget deficit. I need money to basically implement whatever policies I'm thinking of in terms of anti-corruption and economic and social reforms. If they're going to give me money, I wouldn't say no. So we're going to see if Kais Saied, not the principled guy, but the tactician, the guy who's turning now into a traditional politician, if he's going to succeed or not. That's something to be answered, I think, in the coming months.
Thank you very much, Tarek. Bobby, do you want to react to this question, or do you want to move to the next one that is related as well?
Is the next one the Rose Alvarez question?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I would like
Oh,
to.
you can.
I'd like to respond to that. I think she brings up a very interesting point about Kais Saied and old parts of the old regime interacting. And she writes, it's known that a part of the old regime has been trying to erode and undermine the parliament and the political regime since 2014. I think that's really interesting. And I think you can look at it in a different way also. Because what does the old regime really mean? It means capturing the levers of government to distribute money to your cronies. right? It's the economic status quo. So the old regime with new families, old families, new political parties participating in parliament and doing the same political performances, engaging in the same political behavior is not really the old economic regime at all. It's just the economic regime that's the status quo. And so I think many Tunisians would say that that is the old regime. It's these families, these political parties that are engaging in the same behaviors as you saw within a single party regime, only doing it in such a way that it actually sort of erodes the capacity of the state to a much greater level. Yeah. Thanks.
Great. Tarek, do you want to comment on Kais Saied and the former regime? And then perhaps also on the second part of Rosa's question, which I think is very, again, interesting, and it's about international alliances, the support of Emirates and Saudi Arabia. Is there not a certain kind of paradox when Kais Saied is presenting himself as a symbol of the 17th of December revolution, and those kind of countries represent the counter-revolution? How do you read it, and what are the risks? I know you touched on it, so I thought that maybe you can expand on that part a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's about power politics. Again, it's not about, when we talk about the counter-revolution, well, what you're going to do with this money is my main issue here, not by whom the money is given. If the money is given to ease up the pressure of the international Western community on Kais Saied and prepare the ground for serious reforms, doesn't mean that it's counter-revolution. Counter-revolutionary has to be defined by content, not by form. Same thing with the old regime, as just Bobby was saying. What is the old regime? Is Al-Nahda part of the old regime? Since Al-Nahda has been repeating some of the behaviors and some of the policies of the old regime, is Al-Nahda part of the old regime? Is it about chronology or about content? I think it's about content of policies, not about chronology. It's not about who was before 2011 and who was after 2011. That's, I think, a more serious debate about the old and the new, the revolutionary and the counter-revolutionary. It's about content rather than about form. So it's the same thing with by the way, Kais Saied now is facing off, not only Nahda, he's facing off also Abir Mousi, who's the leading figure of the old regime. His clearly criticizing her. He's sometimes preventing her from having her usual political activities, and clearly he's facing both the old regime, that is the pre-2011 regime, and the post-2011 regime. It's a huge task. It's so many enemies, and that's actually a major issue with Kais Saied. I mean, having so many enemies at the same time, but he's having so many enemies within the political elite, not among the main social structures of society. Now he has enough popular support. He's relying on that popular support. And that's why the main question is how he can maintain that popular support as he's fixing budget deficit, as he's negotiating with the IMF, how he can reform economically and financially without hurting his popular support. It's the major question, really, not his relation with the political elite. Much of the political elite is really now out of context, I would say.
And there's been some interesting work on why he remains to be the most popular politician since 2011, even though his support went down after his election in 2019. It didn't fall as much as many would have expected, given his what seemed to be inaction at that point. And the same thing now, the popularity is still, I believe, at about close to 80%. But I agree, Tarek, it's about how to keep that when these hard questions are coming up right now. A question from Shayna Marshall for both. If you can talk a little bit about the reaction and strategies of the trade unionists and also of socialist activists in Tunisia.
I was responding to that. Bobby? Me?
Very
quick.
I'll respond with UGTT and I'll let Tarek respond about the various lefts. The UGTT from the beginning of, from July 25th has taken a very caution-driven approach to what's going on. They publicly said that something had to happen, that they supported the spirit of Kais Saied's action, but they are getting quite anxious as well about sort of Kais Saied presenting a roadmap, defining what he's going to do in the future. And I think most recently, just yesterday, the UGTT received a number of political opposition parties, and following a meeting with the German foreign minister, the head of the UGTT, said that sort of the state is not a toy, and he reminded Kais Saied that sort of time is of the essence. And so UGTT's been sort of across the board. It's not been super critical of July 25th, but it has been critical of the perceived notion that Saied's not moving forward in ways that are going to help Tunisia sort of recover politically, economically, and socially.
Graham, can I ask one last question that just came in, and then we'll finish in a minute, which that's the 15 extra, the total discussion.
I think that's great.
Okay, great. So here's a question to Tarek, and I'm just going to a quick plug. Tarek and Bobby wrote a really interesting piece together that's coming out in Middle East Report, I think, shortly, where a lot of these issues are teased out in greater detail. So this question is from Mehdi Ben Girat to Tarek. A lot of observers are reading dangerous signs that Saied is slowly but surely moving towards a dictatorship. In 3 months, we see a slow disintegration of freedoms of speech, signs of an increase of the cult of personality, fewer tolerance for dissenting public opinions, all while no major anti-corruption measures are done. How plausible is a scenario close to the Egyptian one? And I think here we're talking about 2013 in Egypt.
Hi, Mahdi, great question. Actually, I mean, the similarities between Kais Saied and the Sisi are certainly there. I have no doubt that there are people in Tunisia who want to have an Egyptian scenario in Tunisia. The objective foundations, the actual material foundations for an Egyptian scenario in Tunisia are just absent. The main reason why we have a Sisi, and I was there just after the coup in 2013 in the middle of July, and you can see not only the hatred towards the brother, but also you have an going back to the 19th century with a lot of power and influence, with a network of influence that goes more than any other political and social entity. So that's the real material foundation of a Sisi. We cannot imagine a Sisi without that. It's not just a person, it's an institution. Kais Saied doesn't have that. Kais Saied has the support of an army that is limited in influence, limited in power, and it has the support of that army mainly because of the popular support. I wouldn't go into details, but the main reason why the Tunisian army went against Ben Ali in 2011, went with Kais Saied in 2021, it's because of the wave of the popular support. In other words, whenever the popular support is going to decrease, we're not going to see the Tunisian army facing off in a bloody manner the Tunisian population. We're not going to have Rab'a in Tunisia. That doesn't have its material foundations. And the international community, especially the US, is playing smartly with that, especially with the last report asking the State Department to have a report about if the Tunisian army is supporting in any way anti-democratic measures. They know very well what the Tunisian army is doing, but clearly that's an implicit message that we're watching, and the Tunisian army is hearing that message without any doubt, and much of the Tunisian army's budget is coming from the US. That's a reality. Now, these are the limits of Kais Saied. He cannot be a Sisi. But at the same time, he wants to be a strong president. And sometimes that means, especially in the exceptional state, means basically defying, questioning basic human rights. And that's happening, especially when you put your opponents in military trials. even though they are civilians. That's a clear problematic issue. I'm not seeing, however, that's something as a growing issue that's gonna turn over things. Kais Saied is criticized now in TV media stations. As I would characterize a media pundit in one of the radios, and we criticize Kais Saied on a daily basis. And I came just now from a whole hour of basically bashing the guy from left to right. So it's not really Egypt. I was in Egypt in the summer of 2013. And if you look like a Brotherhood guy, you might be basically beaten out in Cairo streets. So let's be very, very careful about drawing any comparisons between Tunisia and Egypt for these following different reasons. That does not mean that we shouldn't be alert. We should be alert. We should be there, always saying that if something goes wrong, we have to say it's wrong. But I don't see any possible, objectively speaking, any possible similarities between the Tunisian and the Egyptian model.
Thank you very much. And with this, there's also a great comment by Bill Lawrence about some of the shifts and some of the fears that a lot of people have been talking about over the last few weeks. He sent it to everyone so everyone can read it. But with this, I'm going to hand it back to Graham and thank our panelists again for unpacking some of these what I find to be extraordinarily complex issues that are evolving daily, almost daily.
Yeah, Laryssa, thank you, Bobby, thank you, Tarek. This is great, really insightful panel and great discussion. Thank you everybody for attending, for the questions, and especially thank you to Rachel Schaefer for helping us put this on. I just want to flag Hassan Abbas will be joining the Middle East Policy Forum on November 2nd. Stay tuned for an invitation talking about the Taliban and Southwest Asia, and some security issues there, new directions in security in Southwest Asia. So please stay tuned for that invitation. And again, thank you for joining us this morning.